Hi team, welcome back to the latest in the anatomy series. This is cardiovascular system part 2. In this lecture today we're going to look at the valves of the heart, the inner working of the heart, and we'll also be looking at the measures of cardiac function, so how we can typically tell the difference between fit and unfit and the health of a person's heart. And we'll finish up by looking at blood and the components of blood and what they do for the system too. So we're clicking through to where we were up to last time. We're going to start with the valves of the heart here, and up until this point we've focused mainly on the 4 key chambers of the heart. That is the right and left atrium we can see up here, the receiving chambers, the right and left ventricles that we see down here, the pumping chambers of the muscle around the edges here. And we've also looked at the main vessels that bring blood back to the heart, the systemic veins here, and also the vessels that carry blood away from the heart, the systemic arteries. So the only other players that we need to be aware of here are these 4 valves that we see in between chambers here. So we need to know their names and their function. So we'll start on the right hand side of the heart, which is pictured on the left here for reasons I've described before. We're looking at the largest of the valves here, and what you can see are these flaps of tissue, and they have these string, sort of parachute string type tendons that are attached to them here, and these attach to the papillary muscles within the heart chamber. So when the heart chambers flex effectively, or when the muscles work, that will then pull the papillary muscles here, pulling through the ligaments and pop the valve open so that blood can flow from one chamber into the next. So the main role of valves in the heart is to ensure that blood only flows one way. Obviously we're talking about a double or interconnected pump here. We've got the top chambers working simultaneously to pump blood down to the bottom chambers, and then we've got the bottom chambers, the ventricles, pumping simultaneously to pop blood up towards the pulmonary system or out towards the body. Now, in order for blood to keep going in one direction, of course, once blood passes through the valve, we need to close that valve as we create pressure down here and, of course, send blood in the direction we want it. If the valve, of course, wasn't closing properly, blood would flow back the way it just came, which would impede the process of blood flow. So the first one we've got here is called the tricuspid valve. It's called tricuspid because it is made up effectively of 3 flaps. We can only see 2 of these flaps here because, of course, we're looking at a 2-dimensional picture rather than a 3-dimensional picture here. Blood flows into the right atrium. A small impulse is sent down to the atrial wall where the atrial wall contracts, popping open the valve and sending blood through the ventricle here. Once the blood has filled the ventricle here, the valve will close before another contraction of the ventricle sends the blood up through what we call the pulmonic valve. And that blood, of course, is off to the pulmonary arteries, which will carry blood to the pulmonary system, which, of course, is the lungs, to receive oxygen. When the blood comes back from the lungs, we know it pours into the left atrium here through the pulmonary veins, and, of course, fills the chamber in the left atrium here. A minor contraction of the atrial wall will pop open the valve, sending the blood down into the left ventricle here. We'll close that valve. The left ventricle, powerful musculature here, will contract, pinging open the aortic valve, and that blood will then rush up through the aorta, the main artery in the body here, and then off to the systemic arteries and the rest of the body. So, as I said, valves ensure one-way blood flow, and blood always flows from a higher pressure to a lower pressure. So we need to build some pressure by contracting the walls of the atrium. That'll force the pressure up, popping the valve open, and send the blood down into the ventricles with gravity. As mentioned, the 4 main valves are the bicuspid, or mitral valve, this one is known as. So the mitral valve, the name comes from, they suggest the shape of a pope or priest's hat in the Catholic Church, so it looks a little like that, and that's located between the left and right atrium, left atrium and left ventricle, and the tricuspid valve, which of course was between the right atrium and right ventricle, and the slightly larger of the 2. It's an easy way to remember that. The larger one is the tri being bigger than bi, and the bicuspid one slightly smaller. The aortic valve, of course, separated the left ventricle from the aorta, and the pulmonic valve separated the right ventricle from the pulmonary arteries. Here we can see the function. You can see blood is exiting the right ventricle here and the left ventricle over here. And of course the two valves, the pulmonic and aortic valves, are opening, allowing blood to shoot out, and the tricuspid and bicuspid valve are closed to ensure that blood doesn't flow back the same way. This little video here, just going to skip over that. You can watch that in the full Prezi that is immediately above these video lectures. So when you see the heart beating, and if you were to look at that video there, you'll see that they work harmoniously, meaning that the bicuspid and tricuspid valves pop open at the same time, and then the aortic and pulmonic valves pop open at the same time. And it's effectively those openings and closing of the valves that cause the sounds of the heartbeat that we know as lub-dub or the dolph, depending on what country you come from. So the first is the smaller sound of the bi and tricuspid valves opening and letting the ventricles fill, and then the larger sound is the more powerful contraction from the ventricles that are popping open the aortic and pulmonary valves. So you get a dub-dub sort of sound going there. So there are a few measures of heart function that we need to be aware of. These can give us indications of the health of the heart. They can also give us indications of a person's fitness. And by taking these base measures, we can then use them in the future after putting in place programs of training to ensure that our people have increased their cardiovascular capabilities. And that's one of the key markers of fitness, is your cardiovascular health. So one of the ones I'm sure you're aware of is heart rate. It's a key indicator in many cases of fitness level and health. But that's just one of a few really key measures that we're going to go through here. So we'll jump on in. Here we have our fit-looking heart. And if we dive inside his eye, we find the term cardiac output. And it is what it sounds like. Cardiac, we know, references the heart. Output means to come out. So we're measuring something that comes out of the heart. And in this case, we're measuring the amount of blood that is ejected from the left ventricle out to the body in 1 minute. So essentially that's the blood that is leaving the heart on the way to the body's tissues, and we want to know how much blood leaves the heart in a minute, and that will constitute cardiac output. And cardiac output's worked out using a well-known equation where cardiac output represented by Q equals SV times HR. Now HR, you've probably guessed, is heart rate, and SV, if you're not aware, is something called stroke volume. And these are the two measures we'll look at right now. So heart rate is obviously the number of beats that your heart takes per minute. The average person should have a heart rate somewhere between 60 to 85 beats per minute. If your heart rate is elevated higher than that at rest, that probably indicates that your heart is not as conditioned as it could be and is working quite hard to deliver the amount of blood that your body needs across a minute. If it's lower than that, there's a good chance that you've got a fairly well-conditioned heart, because as we know, a heart is a muscle, and if you train a muscle works more effectively. So in this case, this muscle is designed to pump blood, and that means it would be more effective at pumping blood, leading to a reduction in the need to pump as many times. The amount that you can eject from your left ventricle in one squish is your stroke volume, and is a good indication of heart condition. Like we said, the stronger your heart, the more blood it should be able to eject in one beat. There's another term that's not on the slide here, but it's called ejection fraction. And the ejection fraction is the amount of blood that is in the left ventricle prior to a contraction, and the amount of blood that's left in the ventricle after the contraction takes place. And what it indicates is that we don't generally pump all of the blood out of our left ventricle out into the system each beat. Some resides in there. So an average resting ejection fraction is about 50%. So 50% of the blood that's in that ventricle gets pumped out. So if we look at the average being pumped out at 70 mils, that tells you that the volume of an average left ventricle would be about 140 mils, because 50% of that is coming out, 70 mils coming out, and that would leave 70 mils in there. That also indicates that if you can make your heart stronger and more efficient, then each pump could actually increase the ejection fraction and therefore pump more blood out of the heart per beat. And if you did that, then the mind wouldn't stimulate the heart to beat as many times, because you'd deliver more blood per squish. Now at rest, your cardiac output is somewhere around 5 litres per minute. And that's the amount of blood you need circulating your body to deliver oxygen to the cells that require this constant supply. Now, that will differ depending on your size. So bigger people will have a larger cardiac output because there is more blood in their system and there's more cells to keep alive. And smaller people will probably have less than the 5 litre mark there. Females, of course, typically have slightly less than males. During maximal exercise, in some people, cardiac output can exceed 35 litres per minute. So that would be a 7-fold increase in the amount of blood that is pumped out from the heart per minute. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you get more blood during that time. You simply shift the blood that you have in your system, your 5 to 6 litres of blood, around multiple times during a minute. And we achieve that, of course, as you all know, by increasing our heart rate primarily. So why does cardiac output change during exercise? Primarily, as just mentioned, cardiac output increases due to an increase in heart rate. And we all know that. We know that when we start exercising, our heart rate increases. Now, how does it increase? Well, if you kept increasing the intensity of the exercise you were doing regularly across a time frame, you'd find that it increases linear, and that is in a diagonal straight line up until your max heart rate. Now, your max heart rate is determined by your age, effectively. So males, we operate on an equation 220 minus your age gives you your estimated maximum heart rate. So that tells you that younger people have more beats at their disposal than older people. A 20-year-old male would have a maximum predicted heart rate of 200, whereas a 40-year-old male would have a maximum predicted heart rate of 180. Females, you can see, are slightly different figures. 226 beats minus your age is a more accurate figure there. So every year of your life, you effectively lose access to 1 beat per minute. Now, we know heart rate goes up with exercise intensity, but so does stroke volume, at least initially. So what happens is not only does your heart beat faster, but it beats stronger when you start working out and demand for this extra blood flow. Now that can only happen for so long, and you can't just keep getting a stronger and stronger and stronger heartbeat, and they find that it generally plateaus at around that 40% effort mark. So when we're working out at lower intensities, at less than sort of 40% of effort, instead of our heart rate just racing up very quickly, instead our heart pumps a little harder as well, and those initial increased heartbeats will eject more blood per beat, increasing our stroke volume and ensuring that our heart rate doesn't have to climb significantly. So that's great. If you're just walking from the car to the office or something like that, you don't want your heart rate to start racing. So an increase in heartbeat strength will increase the amount of blood that comes out of the left ventricle in that beat, and therefore the need to beat so many times is reduced. Once we go beyond that 40% effort mark, however, everything is really reliant on an increase in heart rate. So the heart simply has to work faster and faster to shift the same amount of blood around in your body, but shift it around more times to deliver the oxygen and remove the waste that is being produced through exercise. So your stroke volume, the increase in heart strength of contraction, and the amount of blood coming out per squish is really governed by 3 key things. Number 1, preload. So that's the amount of tension that's in the ventricle prior to contraction. And the way to increase preload is to flood the ventricle with more blood. So more blood enters from the atrium, stretching the walls of the ventricle. And due to that stretch sort of reflex that muscles can go through when they're put into a stretch first, the rebound strength of contraction is much higher, and therefore more blood gets ejected. Now that naturally occurs during activity, because as we've mentioned before, your muscles are helping to squish that venous blood back to the heart at a greater rate. So more blood is flooding into the heart, expanding the atrium first, and then expanding the ventricle as it's pumped down forcibly into the ventricle. And then, of course, that preload is going to stretch the ventricle muscle and then cause a more forceful contraction. Number 2, for factors that influence stroke volume, is the contractility of the actual muscle. So the stronger your heart is through training, the more it can elicit a strong heartbeat. And therefore, if you are fitter, and you have a more conditioned heart and a stronger and hypertrophied left ventricle musculature system there, known as the myocardium, then you'll be able to contract more forcibly and pump more blood out when needed. The third thing that can affect stroke volume is the afterload. And that's really dependent on the state of your blood vessels that the ventricles feed, and by that we're talking about the arteries. If your arteries are narrowed or clogged, then of course blood isn't all going to be able to fit into that small space as it gets ejected forcibly from the left ventricle, and if it can't fit, it will try and come back, and therefore that will prevent more blood coming out in the next heartbeat. So the state of your blood vessels is another big indicator of the amount of blood that can come out per beat. During exercise, a lot of your peripheral blood vessels to your skin and your arms and legs, because of a lot of muscular work going on, but also because of a lot of heat needing to be released to the skin, a lot of those smaller blood vessels will vasodilate and open up. And that will actually reduce the amount of tension or tightness within your arteries and major blood vessels, and therefore more blood will be able to pump out of the heart and into those blood vessels because of a vasodilation or opening up of those vessels. Alright, so just to recap, during exercise, stroke volume mainly increases due to increase in venous return. So you get more blood flowing back to the heart, a more complete filling of the heart, and a more forceful ejection, and therefore, of course, more blood coming out per squish. Heart rate, of course, increases because of the demand for blood flow by the working muscles. They're demanding more oxygen and nutrients, and they're demanding the removal of waste, primarily heat and CO2. And just a little point down the bottom there, newborn infants, higher heart rates, they are explained by the fact that they have obviously tiny little hearts. So when you've got a tiny little heart and not much comes out per beat, then of course you're going to have to beat a hell of a lot of times to supply the cells with the oxygen it needs. So they usually sit somewhere around that sort of 120, even up to 130, mid 130 mark. As their heart grows, along with their body, you'll see that number start to diminish. But children, as a general rule, have higher resting heart rates than fully grown adults. Alright, so we start looking at the effect of exercise now. As I mentioned earlier, heart rate increases linearly with exercise intensity. So what we're looking at here is a little treadmill test done here, and you can see treadmill grade. So this is the incline on the treadmill. We're working at a 3 mile per hour speed, but we're raising the incline by degrees effectively here. And what you see is that from rest, and these people here, for example, when they started this program, and this actually was only a walking program that these people did, they were obviously not in great shape because their resting heart rate when they started exercise was 100. You see that on the initiation of exercise, their heart rate climbed. And then because every minute the gradient was going up, that it continued to climb and climb and climb in a linear fashion until we peaked out and reached our max up here. Okay, so from this we can infer that these people maybe were 40 years old. If they achieved their max at this point at 180, 220 minus age, if it was a male, would be about this marker here. Now a few weeks later, after doing their cardiovascular exercise routine, they were back and retested, and we see that on the dotted line here with the trained. So this is them untrained and this is them after some training. And we can see that they started at much lower heart rates, just on the 80 mark here. They still had the initial increase, and then they still increased in a linear fashion, but you can see that they weren't as steep, and that because they started lower, they were able to go longer before they reached their max. And that effectively explains cardiovascular fitness. It enables you to start from a lower heart rate, meaning you have more heart rates to play with before you get to your maximum. And also, as we get fitter and fitter, this level, this linear line here, flattens out, which means you can go longer and longer before you reach your max. Now, that also means at any given level of intensity, the exercise is going to be easier for your heart. And the main reasoning for that, why would heart rate come down? Now, you haven't necessarily built terribly more cells, so you don't need more blood. You need the same amount of blood circulating as you did before, but your heart is now stronger. It's pumping out more per beat, and therefore you don't have to beat as many times. So what we're saying is the heart has got stronger, stroke volume has gone up, and therefore heart rate can come down. And that is an effect of fitness. So a chronic effect of exercise is a decrease in heart rate at any level of exercise intensity that you choose to work at. However, your max will be unaffected because that's determined by your age. If we were to see sub-maximum exercise, so this is increasing intensity, but let's say we just did 3 miles per hour and we stuck at 6 on the treadmill grade here, we would see their heart rate increase initially, and then after 2 to 3 minutes we'd see it plateau. And that indicates, when it plateaus, it indicates that your heart is delivering enough blood to maintain the amount of oxygen, the amount of nutrients that the muscle needs, and remove the amount of waste effectively. So the body settles in at that pace. And you can continue doing that as long as you're well fueled and hydrated. That can continue for a good period of time. So, the effects of fitness, before and after. One thing you can see here is the vascularity of the heart that's improved here. So you can see a lot more blood vessels occurring here. We're also going to have a slightly larger, slightly more muscular look to the apex here. Down here you can see this one is quite pointed, and this one here is a little bit more bulbous, which means there's a bit more muscle mass that's been dropped into that bottom portion of the heart there. And this little table on the right here shows you pretty clearly what happens between untrained and trained athletes, or non-athletes as it may be. So what we have in the list here is an untrained male, and if we look down 2 points here, we have a trained male. Now what we can tell you is they both have the same needs or requirements for blood, which is 5 litres per minute. Their Q, the cardiac output, is 5 litres per minute at rest. But they're actually getting it in very different ways. The untrained male has a stroke volume of about 70, which is that average sort of stroke volume mil value. Now in order to get his 5 litres of blood round, his heart has to beat 72 times. So the equation would read heart rate times stroke volume, 72 times 70 is 5,000 mils or 5 litres per minute. Now the per minute measurement comes of course from heart rate, which is measured in beats per minute. We know how much comes out in one squish. We now know how many times it squishes. In a minute we can tell you what your literage per minute is. If you look at the trained male, his stroke volume is 100. Now we should be able to answer this question now from what we've just learned. Why is his heart able to pump out 100 mils per minute? And the answer is, of course, he's had some hypertrophy of the heart muscle, the myocardium, which means that his heart is stronger and can pump out more blood per beat. He now pumps out 100 mils per squish, and so his heart only has to beat 50 times to get the required 5 litres. That's a 22 beats per minute decrease achieved through fitness and having a stronger heart. Okay, so benefits of that are obviously, at rest, you save 22 beats every minute of your life that you're alive. And that's got to be good for your heart, which effectively does have a finite amount of beats in it. It's supposed to be about 2.5 billion heartbeats in an average life cycle. So if you're saving 22 beats per minute, times that by 60, you get an hour. Okay, times that by 24 to get 24 hours, and you can see pretty quickly thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of beats are saved over a period of time. Females, same deal really, just not quite as impressive as what we're looking at in the male in terms of difference here. So the untrained female, slightly smaller heart to body ratio sizes there, needs about 4.5 litres of blood, gets it by pumping out 60 mils every beat with their slightly smaller heart than the male. So they need to beat 75 times a minute to get that 4.5 litres out. The trained female gets the benefit of having a stronger heart. You'll note not quite as strong and efficient as the male heart here, with the ability to pump out 80 mils per squish, meaning she can sit 20 beats lower than her untrained female counterpart and sit at a 55 heart rate to achieve that. So still the benefit. And this is where things get interesting. Let's say we ramp it up now and we take it up to heavy exercise. Now in this case here we're looking at an untrained male with a max heart rate of 200, so obviously a 20-year-old male. See how the untrained male's heart has increased its ability to pump out blood. Okay, you can see that his stroke volume has risen from 70 to 110 mils, so a 40 mil increase in stroke volume. And that comes, if you remember, because of that increase in stroke volume that occurs when you start exercising, just simply because your heart beats a little harder as well as being faster. Now, to get up to maximum, we can take his maximum stroke volume and we times it by his maximum heart rate, and that gives us a figure of 22 litres per minute that he's delivering out to his body tissues to facilitate oxygen, nutrient and waste delivery. Now compare that to the trained male, and what we see here is a stroke volume due to their stronger, more efficient heart that is able to pump out 180 mils per beat. Now if we compare that to what it was before, he was at 100, that's an 80 mil increase, or double the amount of increase that the untrained male was able to produce. Now he doesn't even have to go to maximum. You can see he's only sitting on 190 here. If it's the same 20-year-old, we're not even at 100% effort yet. Okay, but because of this large stroke volume, this powerful heart, he can deliver 34 litres of blood to his muscles per minute. Now that's an increase of 12 litres of blood per minute circulating his body compared to his untrained counterpart. And just step back and think for a moment, what is an extra 12 litres of blood per minute going to do for you while you're exercising? Number one, you'll automatically think, well, we can deliver far more oxygen and far more nutrients. If we harness on the oxygen one for a start, then if we can deliver substantial amounts more oxygen during exercise, that allows us to stay aerobic for far longer than we would be able to otherwise, because we can match the oxygen demands of muscle and keep a constant supply coming. That means if you're working aerobically, you can work at much higher intensities aerobically, meaning you could still run for 30, 40, 50 an hour, 2 hours, while working aerobically at this higher pace. Now, if the untrained male tried to match you at that pace, they'd of course go anaerobic and last a couple of minutes before they blew up. They don't have the capacity because they have 12 less litres of blood circulating around doing the job of delivery and removal. And removal is probably the key thing here. Okay, we've got these CO2 levels rising, these heat levels rising, and we need to maintain a constant temperature and to remove that CO2 from the system to avoid a build-up of lactic acid within the muscles. And of course with 12 extra litres, okay, circulating the body in that 1 minute, that's a lot of waste that can be recirculated away from the muscle tissue and out to the skin for removal, and of course back to the lungs for removal. So the last thing to look at on this graph here is the untrained versus trained female, and some similarities to what we talked about above. There are some slight disadvantages for females regarding the cardiovascular system. So we have a look down here. We can see that an untrained female, obviously a 26-year-old that has achieved a maximum heart rate of 200, can get around 90 mils of blood pumping out of their heart per beat. So that constitutes about 18 litres of blood flow to muscles during maximum exercise. If we look at the trained female, we get the increased benefits here of the increased stroke volume going on, but you can see it's nowhere near the increase that the trained male had over his untrained counterpart. Here we're looking at a change from 90 mils stroke volume to 125 mils, so a 35 mil increase over and above what the untrained female was able to elicit. And between the males, you can see there's a 70 difference, so almost double the increase there. If running at 190 beats per minute with this additional stroke volume here, you can see they can deliver around 24 litres of blood, so an additional 6 litres of blood to their untrained counterpart, which is still hugely beneficial to the fit female. However, it makes pretty sad reading when you look at the untrained male with his 22 litres of blood delivery against the 24 litres for the trained female, who's potentially doing the same amount of training as the trained male here. So definitely an increase, just not to the same degree that you'll find in a male. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. One is a smaller heart to body size ratio, as we mentioned before, and there are also other knock-on effects as well, like reduced red blood cell numbers and things like that due to a menstrual cycle that a male doesn't have to put up with there too. But regardless of that, still an increase in heart efficiency when you're trained for the female, and therefore more literage delivery, allowing you to deliver more nutrients, oxygen to muscles and remove more waste. I guess the upshot of all this is if you see a female training alongside males at a high rate, she's actually far superior in terms of her fitness level than the male, who has the fallback of having these extra literages, just having a larger heart to body ratio size. Alright, so during prolonged exercise, that means longer duration type stuff, we've already established that heart rate effectively goes up initially for 2 to 3 minutes, then plateaus. And what we'll see is cardiac output will remain the same because you're running at the same rate. And let's say your body's demanding 15 litres of blood per minute to maintain its current output. Then the 15 litres per minute stays the same. But what changes, of course, is that your heart rate has to increase and your stroke volume has to increase to get it there. Now, if you keep going for long periods of time, what's going to start to happen is your stroke volume is actually going to start to decrease. And this is known as a product called cardiovascular drift. So the drift references the fact that heart rate is going to start to drift up. Okay, so I'd like to introduce another concept that occurs during prolonged exercise. So this is where you're exercising for long periods of time, where the chance of getting dehydrated has arisen, and that would be due to obviously sweat losses during the exercise, and would be particularly relevant in hot or humid conditions. So imagine you're running, and you've been running along at a set pace for a period of time now, let's say 30-40 minutes, and you've been sweating freely, and of course to keep running at that pace you've had to deliver a set amount of blood to your muscles. So let's say at the pace that you're running, your muscles have required 15 litres of blood flow going around your body per minute. Now we need to keep that 15 litres of blood flow happening to keep working the muscles at the same rate and keep our pace. But what's going to start to happen is eventually, due to loss of blood plasma and sweat, you're going to end up with less blood in the system. And it's virtually impossible as you're running to replace the full amount as you're going. So what's going to happen is the amount of blood that returns to your heart each cycle is going to diminish. And that's because it'll be cooling at the surface of the body, the skin, to remove heat. And of course we lose blood plasma and sweat. So what happens then is the stroke volume starts to decrease slowly because less and less blood is returned in the veins following the removal of the blood plasma and sweat. In order to keep Q the same, the 15 litres going around, then your heart rate has to increase. And that means that the blood volume that gets sent around the body remains at 15 litres per minute. Now, this heart rate drifting up when stroke volume is drifting down is known as cardiovascular drift. And it's due to that increase in body temperature and the sweating and the reduction in blood volume. Now what's going to happen eventually is your heart rate is going to drift up, and it'll be an imperceptible change initially, but soon, you could be increasing 5, 10, even 15 beats per minute. And suddenly that exercise level that you're working at is going to start to feel pretty damn tough. And you're faced with a choice of either slowing down and potentially losing, or you keep pushing and effectively hit the anaerobic sort of zone and blow up. So I've mentioned the heart rate measures for maximum heart rate in previous talkings, and of course we see them here, the 220 minus age and the 226 minus age for females. I want to now introduce you to something called the Kahneman formula, and the Kahneman formula is a formula for working out target heart rate zones. So through some of our other studies, I may have mentioned already that there are certain target zones for working out aerobically that will improve your cardiovascular fitness the most. And typically that range is somewhere in that 60 to 70% of your heart rate max or VO2 max is a place where you can challenge your heart rate just below sort of that aerobic threshold where you might be in danger of crossing over to the anaerobic system. So the Kahneman formula, instead of just going, for example, I'm going to work at 70% of my heart rate max. So what I'm going to do is go 220 minus my age, and then I'm going to take 70% of that. Well, the one thing that doesn't allow for is differences in fitness levels. It suggests that anyone who's 20 years old would have the same 70% marker. And we know that things don't quite work that way. We know that if you're fitter, there are some adaptations that occur that allow you to work usually a little harder to achieve the same sort of, or elicit the results that you want. So the Kahneman formula takes into account your starting fitness level. I'm going to use an example here of a 20-year-old. So if we go into this here, we've got someone who is 20 years old, and 220 minus the age gives them a maximum heart rate of 200. Okay, this is a male. We take that maximum heart rate and we put it down here under step 2. So 200 is their maximum predicted heart rate, minus is their resting heart rate. Okay, so we keep things quite simple here, and let's say we had a pretty fit person here whose resting heart rate was 50. We would end up with max heart rate 200 minus their resting heart rate 50 gives them their heart rate reserve, which in this case would be 150 beats per minute. Now your heart rate reserve is the amount of beats you've got left to use. You're already using your 50 beats per minute, your resting heart rate, so you have an additional 150 beats available to you before you tap out at max heart rate. You use this heart rate reserve figure of 150 here and times that by the percentage that you would like to work at. So I'm going to simplify things and say, well, what if we just said 50%? Okay, so I want to work out at 50%. I've already worked out that my heart rate reserve is 150 for this 20-year-old here. So 50% of that is obviously 75 beats per minute. What we then do to finish off the equation is we add back on the RHR, the resting heart rate. So he would have had 75 beats here as 50% of the heart rate reserve, added on his 50 heart rate, and that would give you a total of 125 beats, which tells you that this person to work out at 50% of their maximum effort would need to be working out at 125 beats per minute. The only way we need to change that to get different zones is obviously instead of timesing by 0.5, 50%, you times it by 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9 to get 60 through 90% zones. I then suggest that you choose maybe a 5-beat window to work in if you're monitoring yourself on a heart rate monitor. It's very hard to stick to exactly one heartbeat. So let's say we'd worked out for that person 125. We might say, right, anywhere between 123 and 128 beats would be ideal for you. Okay, so Kahneman formula, give it a crack for yourself and find out what your workout zones are, and that way you can really tailor your aerobic stuff to make sure you're working in the right level. And like I said, around that 70% mark of heart rate max is considered to be a really challenging level for your cardiovascular system, and a good place to work at to elicit results. All right, on to the final sort of chapter of this here now, and that's called blood. So blood, we're pretty familiar with blood, I'm sure. There's a little video here that we don't have to watch in this time, but it'll give you an outline of what's about to come through. So feel free to watch that in the full prezi. The physical characteristics of blood include the following. Plasma, which we've talked about a few times now. Plasma is that watery, almost clear substance that the cells of your bloodstream float in. So they include ions and proteins and hormones found within there. You'll also find electrolytes and salts floating around in this plasma. And then you have the cellular portion of your blood, which includes the red blood cells, which we know carry oxygen because they contain an iron pigment called hemoglobin. We also have cell fragments called platelets, which initiate blood clotting when a ruptured vessel occurs. And we have white blood cells, which are there to fight foreign invaders and prevent infection. Now, the proportion of your blood that's made up of these cells, the red blood cells, the platelets and white blood cells, the physical components of blood, not the water, is known as hematocrit. Now, if we were to take a vial of your blood, put it in a centrifuge and spin it really fast, what we'd find is the heavier cellular portions go to the bottom and the lighter watery portions go to the top. And this would show what blood would separate into here. Now, the white blood cells wouldn't obviously settle here. They'd be part of the mix, but this is just to show you sort of the percentage of the cells that would be made up of white blood cells. Now, this is the straw-coloured sticky sort of fluid known as plasma that these cells are suspended in. And you can see in this case, if the whole vial is there, and you can see it's making up roughly sort of 50% of this here, that would give an indication of your hydration levels. So the hydration level of your blood is really determined by your plasma level in your blood. The less plasma you have, the thicker your blood will be, and the harder the heart will have to work to get that blood around your body. Now, of course, in dehydration, you'd expect a portion of this plasma to be missing in every sample of blood. You can see in an average sort of college-aged student, about 42% of your blood is hematocrit, which means red, white cells or platelets in there. Okay, so this is the actual functioning part of the blood that carries oxygen and those kind of things. Now, there is a legal upper limit for most internationally sanctioned events, and usually that's around that sort of 50 to 55% hematocrit, and that's what they test, I guess, for blood doping. In a blood doping situation, you're trying to enhance your level of hematocrit so you can carry more oxygen per unit of blood. Obviously very beneficial for endurance-based athletes. So you can see again a slight deviation there between males and females, where females are again slightly disadvantaged at 38% hematocrit as an average for a normal college-aged female. It's mainly determined by your red blood cell numbers. So you can see why in elite competition, if you're legally allowed to compete with around 50%, it would make sense to try and get yours to climb as high as you can up to that point to compete with these other athletes. And you can do that naturally through rigorous training. You can also do it by going to altitude and essentially starving the body of oxygen. And when that happens, the body can't change the environment, so it tries to change its internal environment. It does that by producing more red blood cells. Or you could do it illegally by injecting the hormones that reproduce red blood cells. So one of them is called erythropoietin. You could inject that. That would stimulate the marrow to produce more red blood cells, and you would of course have more in your system. The old school way was to remove a unit of blood from your body, separate out the plasma and hematocrit, freeze the hematocrit, and then reintroduce it in drip fashion at a later date once you've already replaced those cells. One of the final measures we look at of the heart is blood pressure. And it's an interesting question to ask, and the video that I'm just skipping past there will explain an overview of blood pressure and its different elements. But if you essentially ask this in a PT setting, it's like, well, why are you taking my blood pressure? You're not a doctor. What does blood pressure tell us? So before we get into the nuts and bolts of the technical definitions, blood pressure tells you how hard a person's heart is working at rest. So when we take a resting blood pressure, we're working out how hard is your heart working right now to just pump blood around your body when you're resting. And if that is working really hard already, then of course during exercise we know it's going to work even harder, and that could put a person at risk of a cardiovascular event. So it technically refers to the force that is placed on the walls of your arteries by blood as it gets pumped through. And there are two phases to a heart cycle. There is the contraction phase where the heart beats, and that's what we feel when we take a pulse. We feel the blood pulsing against our finger, against the walls of the artery. And that's the maximum pressure, we would say, that pulse that we feel. And that's what we're trying to measure in blood pressure. And then, of course, there's a gap between heartbeats where the pressure dissipates a little, and we want to know what that minimum pressure is as well. So there's two parts to blood pressure. Contraction phase pressure is known as systolic blood pressure. That's when the heart actively pumps blood out into the artery. And the resting phase pressure in between heartbeats is known as diastolic blood pressure. Now, an important thing to note is that the pressure is always there in the system, and that's really important to keep blood moving through the system all the time. The systolic or contraction arterial pressure is the maximum pressure that the blood puts on the wall of the arteries during the contraction phase of the heartbeat. And the diastolic pressure, as said, is the minimum pressure recorded just prior to a contraction of the heart, or what we call the resting phase of the heartbeat. And we record these numbers with one over the other, with the contraction phase or systolic pressure over the diastolic pressure. And as expected, you would expect the contracting phase to be higher pressure than the resting phase. And you can see it is there with a normal sort of systolic diastolic blood pressure of 120 over 80 millimoles of mercury. And that's just a measure of pressure. Okay, so we can see that a considerably higher pressure exists during contraction. Blood pressure is determined by a couple of key factors. Number one, anytime your heart works harder, then blood pressure is going to rise. So as you start to move or exercise, of course your heart pumps harder to try and get blood flow around the body. That's going to force more blood out of the heart. That's going to force more blood into the blood vessels, and therefore pressure will rise. If you have any sort of blockages out in the blood vessels that prevents blood flow flowing freely through them, and that could be things like cholesterol buildup or narrowed arteries or hardened arteries, then you're going to have what we call peripheral resistance. And the key factor in peripheral resistance is the radius of the vessel, so how wide it is. If you squeeze up a blood vessel due to either vasoconstriction or cholesterol, etc., then the heart has to work harder to pump blood into that space, and there's more resistance, so blood pressure will rise. The length of the blood vessel can also impact on that, but of course you can't change that. The length of the blood vessel in your leg is as long as it is, so there's nothing you can do to help that process. Finally, the viscosity of blood. The thicker your blood is, the harder the heart would have to work to move it through, and thus blood pressure rises. And most viscosity issues are going to be around triglycerides or fat floating in your bloodstream due to a poor diet. So this is a little diagram showing the factors that influence your arterial blood pressure, and you can see the things we've discussed there. Anytime your heart rate or stroke volume increases due to your heart working a bit harder, so that could be exercise, or it could be getting scared, it could be being stressed out or getting angry. Those kind of things could do it. The thickness of your blood can cause your blood pressure to increase, and the peripheral resistance that's out in the arteries, any blockages or narrowing can cause that too. And also if your blood volume increases, so if you were to shove a whole lot of liquid down your throat at one point there, and a lot of that was to flood into the bloodstream, then that could cause a blood pressure increase as well. And these things are primarily going to increase systolic blood pressure. Okay, so the contraction force of the heartbeat. So when we exercise, it's important to note that the acute effect of exercise is an increase in systolic blood pressure. And that's quite normal and to be expected. Obviously your heart is going to work harder and faster when you're exercising. So the only thing we need to check here with new clients is to make sure that they're not already working too hard before we get to that point, because of course when we start working them out even at low level intensities, you'll find that their blood pressure goes through the roof. And it's during that strain that occurs with high blood pressure that a heart or cardiovascular incident could occur. Now, the other important thing to note is that diastolic blood pressure should remain relatively unchanged during exercise, because it's only representing the ebbing of the heartbeat or the resting phase. And of course, that's going to be quite short during exercise because the heart rate's going to be very high, but it should still occur. There should still be a short reduction of blood pressure between heartbeats. Now, of course, long term, the chronic effect of endurance exercise is that you would have a gradual lowering of blood pressure. And that's due to a number of reasons, but number one, it should be an improvement in cardiovascular function, okay, a more efficient heartbeat. Number two, an improvement in the structure of your arteries, so removal of cholesterol, more elastic arteries, that kind of thing. And number three, a reduction in the sympathetic responses of the nervous system to exercise. So often when you first start exercise, it's quite a stressful endeavour, but the more accustomed to it you become, the more parasympathetic it becomes, the less neural activation that occurs to cause tension around your cardiovascular system. Now, from a working perspective, in the gym, if you take someone's blood pressure, what are you looking for? Anything over a 140/90 would be considered either pre-hypertension or hypertension, and should then be followed up with a visit to the doctor for clearance. What will often happen in that case is a person will be given some blood pressure medication, which will lower their blood pressure, getting them into a zone that is safe for them to participate initially in exercise, and then of course you're going to have to monitor that over time, because hopefully the exercise also is going to cause a reduction in blood pressure over time, so they may have to get a reduction in medication as they go along, and then hopefully remove the medication altogether. Another thing for the gym floor to look at around blood pressure is there are certain movements that we should probably avoid with people with known hypertension. Anything over the head is considered quite dangerous for someone with high blood pressure, so that includes things like overhead pressing, obviously squat thrusters and those kind of things, and also of course any decline positions where you've got a person lying with their head below below their feet, for example, like a decline bench press or something like that. The other thing you should also look out for is the Valsalva maneuver. And the Valsalva maneuver is something we've all employed at times when doing heavy work, when we take a deep breath, bear down, hold our breath, and perform a lift of some description. And what it does, effectively, if you look at the picture over here, you can see this guy here, he's taking a breath in, he's closed off the old glottis here, which is covered up the windpipe, trapped a whole bunch of air in his lungs in this space here. He's using his abs and bearing down, and that's driven up the diaphragm, and that is causing a compression of air inside these lungs here, which is raising the pressure inside this cavity here. Now that pressure can lead to a squeezing shut of the inferior vena cava here, the main vein returning from the lower body, and if that shuts off, of course, for a period of time, less blood is going to enter the heart. Now when you release that Valsalva maneuver, there's going to be a period of time when not much blood comes out of the heart, and the thing that will get affected most by that is your brain, and of course it could lead to some spotting in front of the eyes, and effectively getting very dizzy. More importantly though, for someone with high blood pressure, holding your glottis closed like this and bearing down is going to cause a dramatic increase in an already high pressure situation, and that's when an incident could occur like a stroke or a hemorrhage, burst vessel, that kind of thing. So particularly dangerous for those with cardiovascular disease or with known high blood pressure, and of course anyone really over the age of 45 that's male or 55 that's female that's in that immediate to moderate risk for cardiovascular episodes. Easy thing to employ in the gym is to say every time a weight is lifted in the gym or a rep is performed, then a breath out should be heard. So you should breathe out on all exertion. Alright, so we finished this off, guys, with a last look at blood distribution. Remember, we looked at a picture in the first lecture which looked at where blood was at rest, and we're going to look at where it changes to now. So of course, when you begin exercise or put up your exercise intensity while exercising, it will require a rapid adjustment in blood flow. And of course that can affect the entire body system. So we know that arterioles are the main effectors of blood distribution. So they're the ones, the little branches off the arteries that have the muscular walls that can close and open to determine where blood goes. So how does blood redistribute during exercise? Firstly, skeletal muscles and the skin are the main demanders of blood. Skeletal muscles are working, doing the exercise you're voluntarily choosing to do, and your skin is requiring a lot of blood to offload heat to regulate body temperature. That means there has to be a reduction in blood flow to some other areas, and the less active organs, I guess, during exercise are those that are more active when you're not exercising, when you're sitting down. Your digestive system, your urinary system, your brain, those kind of places will get a reduction in blood flow. At rest, about 15 to 20% of your total cardiac output is reaching your muscles, and that's mainly postural muscles, just to keep your head up, your shoulders back, and sitting. During exercise, you'll see about 80 to 85% of your total blood flow will go off to the muscles. We can see that in this picture here. Here is somebody at rest, and you can see we've got muscles getting about 1.25 litres, digestive system getting about the same, renal system just on a litre, the brain getting around 750 mils, the skin with about 250 mils, the heart itself about 200 mils, and then other structures about 300 mils going through them. And then if we change to exercise, it's pretty apparent quickly where all the blood has gone. We're now working out relatively heavily at 15 litres per minute circulating, and you can see almost 12 litres of that blood is off to the muscles. Reductions to the digestive system, getting only about a third of what it was getting before, same with the kidneys, and about half of what the brain was receiving. So that should tell you not to make any life decisions while you're running on a treadmill. The skin is the other benefactor of this. You can see a big increase, about a 5-fold increase in blood flow to the skin to offload heat, and of course the heart, and that would include heart and lungs, processing a lot more blood as they have to keep the supply of oxygen going. And that's where that blood flow distribution change lies. How does it happen? Just to recap, you can see the old fella here sitting on the couch. What's happened is he's increased the diameter of his arterioles, and the blood flow to his intestines is increased because it's not doing much elsewhere, the blood, so it can focus on digestion and that kind of thing. And it's done that by shutting down blood flow to the other extremities of the limbs here. See, that's why we typically get pins and needles and get a bit uncomfortable and fidgety when we sit for too long, with reduced blood flow going on there. And then if old mate was to get out of the chair and start exercising, we would see the arterioles heading off to the intestines would decrease in diameter, and then there'll be a dilation of these big blood vessels here that send more blood out to the working muscles and increase blood flow to the legs. Okay, so we've reached the end of the system study here, the cardiovascular system. just want to finish by reiterating the point about why does cardiovascular change occur? Why is there an increase in heart rate? Why is there an increase in blood pressure, stroke volume, cardiac output when we move into exercise? And the determinant of that is based on feedback received by the chemoreceptors within the body. Remember, the whole point is to deliver energy in the form of nutrients and oxygen to the muscles to meet their demands. And as a secondary aspect to that, the removal of waste products, either heat to the skin, and of course carbon dioxide back to the lungs. And those are the primary triggers for change in the cardiovascular system when we transition from rest to exercise. Alrighty, last point you can see down here, whatever exercise that you select to improve your cardiovascular fitness have to be challenging. And that's a problem. You see this a lot. People are out with good intent to do exercise, but not actually challenging the cardiovascular system much. How do you know you're challenging the cardiovascular system? You look at your heart rates. You check your heart rates and know your heart rate zones to make sure you're working in that sort of 60 to 70% bracket. Number 2, we should see sweat. If you're working and challenging the cardiovascular system, you should be sweating freely. And number 3, we monitor breathing rate. Okay, so if a person is walking along or jogging along, having a good old gas bag, nice talk with the person next to them, then they are not working hard enough to challenge their cardio and respiratory systems. So in the gym situation, you see them on the treadmill doing their warm-up or doing some cardio and they're sitting there having a good old talk, casually reach over, plug up the speed until they can answer questions but not necessarily drive the conversation. Alright team, thanks for listening in. I look forward to seeing you again soon.